Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So I had a video request earlier to explain the difference between the Bank Term Funding Program, the discount window, and the repo facility. I think the question was really coming down to is like, what's the difference between these? Aren't they all just different ways of the Federal Reserve channeling money to the big banks? In short, yeah, that's essentially what it is. But the Bank Term Funding Program has ended, and it's not really a facility that is going to be something that the Federal Reserve uses on a continuous basis. Now, whether or not they reestablish the Bank Term Funding Program under a new name, the Bank Term Funding Program was a short-term offering for liquidity to the banks to readjust their balance sheet. They had issues taking place, and if you remember Silicon Valley Bank, this was what triggered it. Those big banks had a balance sheet that was not appropriate for higher interest rates, and the assets that they held started to fall in price dramatically. The people who started pulling their money out of those banks left those big banks with a balance sheet that was very offset, where they had much more liabilities than they had assets, especially the assets that were liquidable, the ones that they could sell right away. So the Bank Term Funding Program was an emergency lending facility to reestablish liquidity into these big banks due to the fact that the interest rates had risen and the asset prices that they had fallen. So we're going to explain that in a little bit more, but that was the difference between the Bank Term Funding Program and, say, the other two facilities that we're about ready to talk about, the discount window and then again the repo facility. Now, the discount window is a place that the banks can go to if they are in need of funding and they cannot find it anywhere else. Now, they could go to the other banks, they can go to places that are typical for acquiring funding, like getting the deposits, from people just like literally putting cash in the bank, again, borrowing it from other banks. But if they come into a situation in which that they are in need of liquidity and they can't really find it anywhere, the discount window is the offering that they could go to in order to get that liquidity. It's like the last-ditch effort. And because it's that last-ditch effort for liquidity, big banks don't really like using it. Nobody really likes using it because it has that stigma attached to it. So the discount window, although is a place that the Federal Reserve can go and hand money to these big banks, it's looked upon as very taboo. And so nobody really wants to use the discount window because of that. Now, the repo facility, this is much different. This was a facility that had been used to swap treasuries, assets for cash. Now, this is not exactly a place that they could go to acquire money, like, say, the discount window, like borrowing money from the Fed. This is a place that they could go to swap treasuries for cash. Now, if we remember back to September of 2019, this is when the repo facility really stepped up. Now, back in September of 2019, there was this huge corporate tax payment that was made. And at the same time, the government was doing a lot of spending. So now these big banks, they are the primary dealers. So when the government is spending, they're the ones who are buying those treasuries. Now, holding on to treasuries, the debt of the United States government, when these big banks, the primary dealers, go and purchase these things and set them on their balance sheet, they're used almost like cash. Like, they're fairly close, like, to being a cash-like substitute, but they're not cash. And there is times in which that they do need cash and not the almost equivalent like a U.S. Treasury. Now, as they were buying all these treasuries and putting them on the balance sheet due to all the government spending that was taking place out there, this tax payment pulled a lot of cash out of the banking system and sent it over to the Treasury General account. This is an account at the Federal Reserve that the Treasury holds, and they use it to pay their bills and stuff like that with. Now, this cash movement to the Treasury General account left the big banks short of cash. And the overnight lending rate between them shot up to like 10% because there simply wasn't enough liquidity in the banking system to provide all the operations for the next day. That's when the government, or not the government, the Federal Reserve, right? The Federal Reserve, because this is something that you really, like, a lot of people have to separate. The Federal Reserve and the government are not the same thing. But this is when the Federal Reserve stepped up with the repo facility and said, hey, you have all these treasuries from all the government spending that has taken place out there. You give us the treasuries, we'll give you cash. You go and operate the next day. At the end of the day, we'll undo this and then redo it again. And we'll make sure that we constantly provide you with all the cash that you need. And this was also termed like the non-QE QE. So the repo facility wasn't exactly a place that was just like willy-nilly handing out cash or lending out cash. It didn't work like that. It was a swap between treasuries and cash, and then later on, as the quantitative easing overwhelmed the system with liquidity, it did the exact opposite. They took cash and handed out treasuries. So this repo facility and the reverse repo facility, this was an operation to keep the liquidity balanced, right? So whether or not the banks had too much or not enough, this facility was going to essentially even it out, help to provide the equilibrium, so to speak. So very different from the discount window, which is the place that the bank can go to if they cannot find liquidity anywhere, like they're, nobody's willing to borrow to them, or there just simply isn't enough liquidity out there. They can't get the deposits, whatever it is that's keeping them from having the operational cash on hand for the next day. They can go to the discount window and obtain that. And again, the BTFP, the Bank Term Funding Program, which has now come to an end, like they're no longer using this facility to lend money to these banks. This was very temporary. It was only a year long, and then it's going to be operational for another year as those banks are paying back those loans. But as far as providing new loans into the system, that Bank Term Funding Program, what it did is it stalled out what would essentially be a collapse of the banking system due to the fact that they had assets that are sitting on their balance sheet that had fallen in value, and they could not sell those assets into the market and provide enough cash to pay their depositors. So like people who had deposited money with this bank, as they're pulling that money out, the banks need to come up with somewhere to get that cash. They take their balance sheet, their assets, they start selling those off to get the cash to pay the depositors back. Now, if those assets, they say they had them on the balance sheet thinking they were worth $100, and all of a sudden they can only get $70 for them, they're taking a huge loss. What the Bank Term Funding Programs came in and said, don't sell the asset. What we'll do is we'll lend you money at the full value of $100. You see how that kind of works? So these banks who had these assets that were falling in price and were going to run short of liquidity as the depositors were pulling their money out, they said, no, don't do that, right? Don't sell off those assets for that lower price. Here's some money, borrow it, readjust your balance sheet so that it has assets on there that are more liquidable. And then at the end of this, Bank Term Funding Program, you will have paid back the loan and have readjusted your balance sheet to be more stress-free. I don't know how to put it. There's nothing as stress-free, but during stressful times, and it comes times for those banks to try and acquire the liquidity that they need by selling those assets. They won't have assets on there that are going to be falling in price dramatically during those times like they were experiencing during like the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. Okay, I hope that explains it. This stuff is very complicated, right? You got to take it just a piece at a time. So, understanding these differences between these, is really important because, yes, essentially it is a place that, banks can go to get the money that they need in order to operate. But each one of these is a very different circumstance that has taken place in which that they would be getting the liquidity from the Fed for whatever reason it is. All right, I hope that helps. Uneducated Economist, you guys let me know.